America once built an empire on a lie so fragile that a single, educated slave could shatter it. Not with violence, not with rebellion, but with words. In the early 19th century, the United States declared itself the world's greatest experiment in liberty while quietly depending on the forced ignorance of millions to survive. And then Frederick Douglass appeared, a man the system was never supposed to produce. Born into slavery in Maryland, legally classified as property, Douglass would grow into an intellectual force so powerful that newspapers accused him of being fictional. His speeches stunned audiences. His writing exposed hypocrisies no one wanted named, and his very existence posed a question America could not safely answer. If a man born in chains could outthink senators, outwrite scholars, and out-argue presidents, then what did that say about everything the nation claimed to believe? Slaveholders understood the danger immediately. Literacy was illegal for slaves for a reason. Education didn't just teach words, it taught comparison. It revealed that slavery was not destiny, not divine will, not science, but a carefully engineered system of control. And Frederick Douglass mastered that forbidden knowledge in secret, stealing his mind back piece by piece, while the nation tried to keep it imprisoned. By the 1840s, his voice was impossible to contain. Crowds packed halls to hear him speak. Abolitionists relied on him. Politicians feared him. And slave states denounced him as a fraud because acknowledging his brilliance meant admitting their entire worldview was a lie. They said he didn't write his own books. They said he had never been enslaved. They said a mind like his could not come from bondage. But Frederick Douglass was real, and that was the problem, because his life proved that slavery was not just brutal, it was built on deliberate, intellectual sabotage. And once Douglass broke free, he did something far more dangerous than escape. He spoke, and America has been trying to explain him away ever since. This is the story they didn't want told. By the early 1800s, the United States had perfected a contradiction. The nation spoke endlessly about freedom while constructing one of the most sophisticated systems of human control in modern history. In the southern states, slavery was not sustained by violence alone. Whips and chains enforced obedience, but ideas enforced permanence. An entire intellectual framework was built to convince society that bondage was natural, necessary, and scientifically justified. Cotton plantations stretched across Maryland, Virginia, and the Deep South, generating immense wealth. By 1820, nearly 4 million human beings were legally classified as property. Laws were written to protect this investment. In Maryland, teaching an enslaved person to read or write was a criminal offense. Not discouraged, not frowned upon, illegal. Legislators openly admitted why. Literacy would allow slaves to question their condition, forge travel passes, read abolitionist newspapers, and learn that in other parts of the world, slavery was already being dismantled. Doctors published papers claiming people of African descent had smaller brains and limited capacity for abstract thought. Ministers preached that slavery was divinely ordained. Politicians cited both from the floor of Congress. These theories were false, but they served a vital purpose. They allowed a nation to exploit millions while preserving the illusion of moral superiority. Maryland's eastern shore was a quiet landscape of tobacco fields, pine forests, and waterways feeding the Chesapeake Bay. Behind the calm surface was a system designed to erase identity. Slave births were rarely recorded. Families were deliberately separated. Children were raised without parents, without history, without names that belonged to them. The goal was psychological as much as physical. Break continuity, destroy memory, prevent self-conception. It was into this world, in February 1818, that Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was born on a plantation in Talbot County, Maryland. He would never know his exact birthday. He would never legally know his father. From the moment of his birth, the system worked to ensure he would never know himself. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was born into slavery in Talbot County, Maryland, on the plantation of Aaron Anthony, a man who managed multiple estates for the wealthy Lloyd family. From the beginning, Frederick's life was shaped by absence. His mother, Harriet Bailey, was a field hand hired out to a plantation 12 miles away. Under Maryland law, she remained property, allowed to see her son only during brief nighttime visits. She would walk miles after exhausting labor, hold him in the dark for a few hours, then leave before dawn. By the time Frederick was 7, she was dead, and the system had succeeded in preventing a bond strong enough to grieve. Frederick was raised by his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, in a small cabin on the edge of the plantation. She told him fragments of family stories and memories of a life before bondage, traces of identity the system tried to erase. When Frederick was 6, she was ordered to return him to the main plantation. She brought him there, pointed out his siblings, then walked away. He would see her only once again in his life. Aaron Anthony, widely rumored to be Frederick's father, never acknowledged him. This silence was not unusual. Sexual exploitation of enslaved women was common, and the resulting children became additional property. Frederick learned early that power in this world was absolute and unaccountable. After Anthony's death in 1826, Frederick was valued alongside livestock and assigned to Hugh Auld in Baltimore. This transfer exposed him to Sophia Auld, a woman who had never owned slaves before. Her brief kindness and decision to teach him the alphabet ignited something dangerous. When her husband forbade the lessons, explaining that literacy would ruin a slave, Frederick understood the truth. Knowledge was the enemy of slavery. From that moment, he began building the mind America feared. Once Frederick Douglass understood that education was forbidden because it led to freedom, he pursued it with quiet obsession. In the streets of Baltimore, he befriended poor white boys who attended school and traded them bread for lessons. Minutes at a time, letters scratched into dirt, words whispered like contraband. He found a discarded copy of the Columbian Orator and hid it in the shipyard, memorizing speeches about liberty, natural rights, and resistance to tyranny. Each page dismantled the lies he had been taught about his place in the world. By his early teens, Douglass could read and write fluently, and with that knowledge came unrest. Newspapers revealed free black communities in the North. Accounts of Haiti's successful slave revolt proved rebellion was possible. The more he learned, the more unbearable slavery became. Learning had done exactly what his master feared. It made him dangerous. In 1833, he was sent back to Talbot County to work for Thomas Auld. His confidence, vocabulary, and refusal to lower his eyes marked him immediately. Auld responded by hiring him out to Edward Covey, a man notorious for breaking rebellious slaves. Covey ruled through exhaustion and terror, appearing without warning, whipping for imagined offenses, denying rest and food. For months, Douglass was beaten until his spirit nearly collapsed. Then in August 1834, something broke, but not in him. When Covey attempted to whip him again, Douglass fought back. The struggle lasted nearly 2 hours. Covey failed to subdue him and walked away, never striking him again. Word never spread, but Douglass understood the truth. The master's power depended on belief. In the aftermath, Douglass secretly taught other enslaved people to read, forming an illegal school in the woods. When authorities discovered it, arrests followed. His first escape attempt failed. Betrayed and jailed, he was sent back to Baltimore. But the lesson was clear. He would escape again. And next time, he would not fail. The truth America never wanted exposed was not simply that slavery was cruel, but that it depended on intellectual fraud to survive. Frederick Douglass was living proof that the system's most sacred claims were lies. He was not an exception. He was evidence of what slavery deliberately destroyed. And once he escaped in September 1838, the danger shifted from physical control to narrative control. When Douglass began speaking publicly in the early 1840s, audiences were stunned. He spoke with precision, historical knowledge, and moral authority that exceeded most educated white men of the era. Instead of confronting what this meant, newspapers attacked his authenticity. Southern editors claimed his autobiography must have been written by white abolitionists. Others insisted he had never been enslaved at all. The logic was revealing. A formerly enslaved man could either be inferior or fictional. He could not be brilliant and real. Douglass understood the trap. To prove his story's accuracy meant exposing himself to legal recapture under the Fugitive Slave Act to protect his freedom meant allowing critics to call him a fraud. The nation demanded proof while holding a knife behind its back. This was the true mechanism of control. If enslaved people spoke too well, they were declared liars. If they spoke poorly, they were dismissed as ignorant. The revelation was devastating. Slavery did not fear rebellion most. It feared contradiction. It feared a man who could dismantle its justifications sentence by sentence. Douglass was hunted not because he had escaped, but because he spoke with a clarity that made the system indefensible. To silence him, America tried ridicule, denial, and erasure. When that failed, it tried to isolate him. But the truth had already escaped, and it could not be recaptured. Frederick Douglass's survival created consequences the nation could not contain. His words spread faster than laws could suppress them. By the mid-1840s, his speeches were drawing thousands, forcing slavery into direct confrontation with its own contradictions. Southern states labeled him an agitator. Editors warned that his rhetoric could incite rebellion. Bounties were discussed quietly. The danger became real enough that Douglass was urged to leave the country to avoid capture. In 1845, he sailed to Britain, where the reaction was immediate and startling. In Ireland, Scotland, and England, he was received not as a curiosity, but as an intellectual equal. Churches opened their pulpits to him. Reformers debated him seriously. He walked freely into hotels, dining halls, and lecture spaces barred to him in America. The contrast was brutal. Abroad, he was treated as a man. At home, he was still legally property. British abolitionists raised funds to purchase his freedom from Thomas Auld in Maryland, finalizing his legal emancipation in December 1846. When Douglass returned to the United States, he did so as a free man, but also as a more dangerous one. He no longer needed protection. He no longer needed permission. He founded his own newspaper, the North Star, rejecting the role of supporting voice and claiming intellectual leadership. This fractured alliances but transformed the movement. Douglass pushed beyond moral persuasion. He demanded political action, constitutional interpretation, and resistance when necessary. During the Civil War, he advised President Abraham Lincoln, argued relentlessly for black enlistment, and reframed the conflict as a moral reckoning rather than a political compromise. The consequence of his voice was irreversible. Slavery could no longer hide behind ignorance. Once Douglass spoke, the nation was forced to listen or openly admit its cruelty. There was no middle ground left. Frederick Douglass did not simply survive slavery. He exposed it. He lived long enough to watch the system that tried to erase him collapse under the weight of its own lies. Born without a recorded birthday, denied family, education, and identity, he transformed himself into one of the most influential minds of the 19th century, not because he was given opportunity, but because he stole back what was deliberately denied. When Douglass died on February 20, 1895, in Washington, D.C., he was 77 years old. He had advised presidents, helped shape constitutional change, and forced a nation to confront truths it had worked tirelessly to avoid. Yet even in death, attempts to diminish him continued. He was called an exception, a rarity, a miracle, anything but proof. But Douglass never claimed to be extraordinary by nature. His life argued something far more dangerous, that brilliance, dignity, and moral clarity are universal, and that systems of oppression survive only by suppressing them. His story stands as evidence of what millions could have become had they been allowed to think, learn, and speak. The question he leaves behind is not historical, it is present. What systems today depend on ignorance to survive? Whose voices are dismissed as impossible, exaggerated, or threatening because they contradict comfortable narratives? If Frederick Douglass were alive now, he would not ask for admiration. He would ask for action. He would ask who benefits from silence and who pays the cost. If this story challenged you, say why in the comments. What part of Douglass's life hit hardest? And what state are you watching from? Subscribe for more buried histories they never wanted remembered.